full-time writer. So I write essays for the New York Times and other places and books, and yeah, that's what I
Yeah,
do. And I take care of three kids.
I've seen you around, and like I say, I enjoyed the book so much. Okay, so I'm going to do this as if we're actually doing a podcast and not having a cup of coffee. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. I am Frank Schaeffer, and my guest today is someone of whom I am a big fan because I've just read her book. In fact, I was saying that I'm working on a new book and she's all over it. So you can blame her when it comes out and all goes wrong because my guest today is journalist, culture critic, and author Ruth Whippman, a former BBC documentary film director. Her writing appears in the New York Times, The Guardian, Time Magazine, and elsewhere. And Ruth is the author of a book that I'm going to ask her to hold up because I read mine on Kindle. I don't have it here, called Boy Mom, Reimagining Boyhood in the Age of Impossible Masculinity. And little boilerplate here, please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on applepodcast.com. And to my Substack commentary, it has to be said, at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And with no further ado, I just want to say, Ruth, first of all, thank you for writing an incredible book. And as I mentioned before we started, I'm working on something related, which we will not talk about. But there was a gap in it in terms of how do I describe a longing I have to do better by boys. And your book completely filled it. And as a father of two wonderful sons who are very good at everything they do and lovely human beings, and two grandsons, one of whom is sitting in the other room during his preschool reading. This is my youngest grandson, who's 14, who I just cooked lunch for. Your book didn't just hit home. It's like I felt I was talking to a friend who was on my side, both as a
Oh, that's
male
so
trying
lovely.
to raise other males right, and at the same time, it just, there's so much out there about, as you say in your book, we know how to talk to girls and we're telling them the sky's the limit is one of the things you talk about. And how about we tell some young men this too and start raising a generation of men that we wouldn't mind have meeting our daughters and granddaughters. And so I can't thank you enough. I just think your book filled a vast void out there. And I can't recommend anything more highly than I recommend this book. I just think Boy Mom is so important. So I don't know
Oh, well,
what to do
thank
with
you.
the introduction.
This is extremely lovely to hear, and thank you so much for your work, not just professionally, but also raising your sons, your grandsons. It's just, yeah, this is really lovely to hear. Thank you.
Yeah. So let me just look at something here that I want to get into. Males like the younger me. So in other words, when I was, what I call raised as a patriarchal misogynist in the evangelical community, thinking I was in charge of everything, talking to my young self, I would say people like that, religious or non-religious, maybe they're part of the manosphere, they follow Andrew Tate, whatever. They need this book, but parents before they get that way need this book. And so Boy Mom, reimagining boyhood in an age of impossible masculinity. By the way, I like the impossible masculinity. First thing I want to say is what you talk about in the book is that you're the mother of three sons and you care about boys' well-being. And your care for boys really touched me because I'm full-time child caregiver to my youngest grandchildren, one of whom is a grandson. And I also think you're incredibly wise. And you write, for instance, here I'm quoting, naming the glaring absence of relational role models for boys as sexism and calling it out is the first step. As soon as I became aware of this lack, I started doing this with my son. So let's start there because that's personal and that's where you live as a mom. And then let's get into it.
Yeah, so what I meant by sort of relational learning, it's just this like way that we are failing to teach boys to have
Yeah.
good social and emotional relationships. And
Yeah.
that's like, it's something that's just, this is a pattern that's age old, age old. I mean, it's that we teach boys and girls to relate in slightly different ways. And a lot of this is really subtle. I think very few parents genuinely believe that they're treating their sons differently than their
Yeah.
daughters. I mean, there are some people who have this ideological mission to do that, but most people, I think these are blind spots. And what I started to realize, I think the first time I really became aware of it was I was in the bookstore with my three sons. And I noticed this like magazine that was on the shelf, and it was clearly targeted towards young girls. And it had
Yeah,
a pink sparkly cover, and it was like, it had a friendship bracelet giveaway on the front. And it was so obviously screaming, this is for girls, this is for girls.
yeah,
And I read it, and the first story in the magazine was like about this girl who'd been invited to these two birthday parties that were happening at the same time. And the girl was becoming really stressed. She didn't want to disappoint either one of her friends. So she sort of decided to go to both birthday parties at the same time in
yeah,
secret and like run between one and go to the next one and then like pretend that she'd been there at the first one the whole time and then run back to the other one. And it was this tale of like intense emotional labor, thinking about somebody else's feelings. You
sure.
don't want to disappoint them. And I realized like this is just completely standard reading for girls. And, they've probably read, my son's female peers have probably read a million stories like that, seen them on TV, seen them in movies. And my boys never see stories like that with boy
Right.
characters. There's never a boy character who's so worried he's going to disappoint his friend that he's running between two birthday
Yeah,
parties. Their stories are all about battles. They're all about fighting. They're all about competition. And, in their stories, it's always a hero and a villain, a good guy and a bad guy. And none of that sort of, being in relationship with other people, the complexity, the mess of it. And you just see this appearing in so many different ways throughout childhood. So there's the stories we expose boys and girls to that are really different. There's the ways that we interact with sons versus daughters.
yeah,
There's all this evidence that shows that we have more emotional conversations with girls. We use more emotional language with them. We listen to their feelings. As parents, we're more willing to engage in like
yeah.
conversations about emotions with girls and boys. We're more tolerant of their emotions. And all of this really adds up over time. And I think this is really a big part of why we're having a crisis of loneliness with adult men.
Yeah. You write, quote, perhaps when we talk about boys' ability to become thoughtful, well-rounded, rational beings, we would do well to borrow from the inspirational, quote, sky's the limit tone we use to talk about girls' prospects, aspirations, and abilities. But first, we need to question how our own internalized sexism colors what we actually consider to have true value. When we say, quote, the sky's the limit, we are generally talking about power, about career, aspirations, and financial success. But the real sky in any well-lived life is not wealth or power or a seat in the boardroom, but meaningful relationships with other human beings. And when I read that, honestly, I wanted to sort of reach out across whatever this is and give you a huge hug and just scream thank you, because to me, that last sentence, and I'm going to read it again now. If anybody who follows me wants to know what Frank Schaeffer believes, here's the deal. And you could carve this on my tombstone. And I live my life to do this. And I so love this line. I'm going to read it again. But the real sky in any well-lived life is not wealth or power or a seat in the boardroom, but meaningful relationships with other human beings. And to me, I have not read anything that is more important than that line. I just think you've nailed everything that the book is for and everything that a well-lived life is for. And by the way, everything that is wrong with our culture in terms of how we define success. To
I think
me, that's the deal. It's not building your own rocket ship. It's not making $1 billion. It's not controlling other people's lives. Ruth Whippman has written the line that could correct everything wrong with our culture if people would read that and take it to heart.
Oh, well, thank you so much. That's so lovely to hear. I think these two things are really bound up together. So we talk about male privilege, we talk about that men have access to like power and success and all of these things, which is true. Male privilege is real. Men get paid more money generally. They do have more access to these sort of top jobs, these top positions. We've not yet had a female president. I hope that changes,
I do too.
but all of this is very, very real. But what we're missing when we talk about male privilege is that there's also like harms in this system. We have this patriarchal system, which is like men have access to power. But because we value what men value, we think that power is the most important thing. But
Yeah.
actually, human connection, human intimacy, really deep down is the thing that is most important to well-lived, psychologically healthy, happy, meaningful life.
Yeah.
And that is where men and boys lose out in so
Yeah.
many different ways. And that was my journey writing this book. I was realizing just the many, many subtle ways we kind of exclude boys and men from real, true intimacy and emotionality.
Yeah.
And in order to believe that that's a real problem, we have to believe that it's worth having in the first place.
Yeah.
You know, in order to believe that men and boys are losing out, we have to value that thing anyway. And I think it becomes this circular problem. You know, we value what men value and we don't value what women value. And so
Yeah.
therefore we sort of don't see it as a loss when men don't have that. But
Yeah.
actually, you know, it's becoming increasingly apparent that men and boys are in crisis because of this lack of human connection.
Yeah. And I love that that's your emphasis, because everything else is boilerplate. You know, the rest, there are many peripheral reasons, but when you talk about the disparity between women and universities and men, when you talk about all these different things, the manosphere, Andrew Tate, you know, Rogan, Musk for that matter, all these models, you know, have missed what you're saying. And somewhere in a lot of those men's childhoods, they missed that.
Right.
So
And
if
I
you dig
think,
back into Musk and his relationship with his father or something, you know, they're all, you know, they all provide a good example of what you're talking about.
yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And, you know, we talk about toxic masculinity, but it's this idea that boys don't get this like emotional nurture right from the beginning. And we see, you
Yeah.
know, this was something that really shocked me when I was researching the book, how much evidence there is to support this idea that right from babyhood, boys don't get the same level of emotional nurture and
Right.
engagement that girls do.
Yeah.
And you see, like right from newborn onwards throughout childhood, they're more likely to receive harsh parenting. They're less likely to receive that like real emotional
Yeah.
engagement, that sort of positive, nurturing touch, all of those things. And these cut you off from, you know, as a boy or a man, it cuts them off from their own emotions and it cuts them off from other people.
Yeah, you write. You know, one of the things you note is the masculine ideal has become ever more cartoonish and extreme. And then you write, as a culture, we are moving away from the gentler family-oriented provider and protector model toward a pumped-up action hero version of fantasy manhood, all muscles and guns and hand-to-hand combat. And then you know, I kind of paraphrase what you're saying here, that the cultural trappings of boyhood have become focused on violence and aggression. And then you go on and say, in almost every toy store, there is a neon pink girls section filled with a mix of sparkle studded objectification in the form of princess dresses, kid makeup, and heavily sexualized dolls. The khaki and the camo hued boys section is devoted in large part to mass slaughter, which I love that you write that, with a few emergency vehicles to mop up the bloodshed. I love your writing, by the way. There's a lot of humor in your book as well. Your sons must enjoy you as a mom. You got a lot of humor, and
Oh,
it's
that's
lovely to
lovely
read.
to
But
hear.
you really nailed it, because that's it, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think also, you know, and I'm a feminist and, you know, and I identify very much with this cause, but like, I think there was all this pushback against the stereotyping of girls. And so, like, you'll see all these feminists like complaining about toys and gendered toys and pink, you know, pink
Yeah.
washing of girlhood and all of that. But they're not really, you know, this sort of whole aggression focus in boys' toys has been kind of a blind spot. You know, I think
Mm.
there's this whole discourse around, you know, we mustn't stereotype girls, we mustn't box girls in, the sky's the limit, the thing that you're talking about, you know, we must give girls all these expansive ways to be human. But meanwhile, we've sort of been ignoring the fact that we're boxing boys into these very rigid, very aggressive
Yeah.
stereotypes.
Yeah, absolutely. You kind of go on and say that. Let's see, where have we got that here? Um, Talk about as they grow up, we should prioritize connection for boys to consciously correct for the built-in isolation. I love that, the isolation in male culture. Even before we consider academics or sports or extracurriculars, we should carve out time for connecting with peers and with family. We need to do this intentionally, to schedule if necessary, and to protect it fiercely. I love that. And that's what you say. And it's really well put. So again, thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question that is a sort of a general question related to your book. Um, First of all, just a little anecdotal stuff about myself that you'll find interesting. I don't know where did you grow up in the UK?
I grew up in London, Southwest
But in
London.
London,
Yes.
proper? Okay.
Well,
Because
in a suburb of London. Yeah.
where?
I grew up in a suburb called Rains Park, which
Yeah,
at that time was extremely nothingy and has been quite heavily gentrified since. But
since then. Yeah,
yeah.
and I grew up in Switzerland as the son of American missionaries and evangelists, and then eventually as a dyslexic who was homeschooling was not working for me. I knew my little section of the Alps very well because I was free to wander, but the homeschooling part didn't. So I found myself at age 10 in a British boys boarding school, what the
Oh,
British call a prep school, which is ages 5, believe it or not, for boys boarding schools through 13 or 14, and then
wow.
in a
I don't,
quote
yeah.
unquote public school. So yeah, I studied in the UK for a while. But I have a story for you there. I arrived not knowing anything and very far behind everyone else. They kept trying to create new sort of subsidiary forms for me to be in as a student of one who couldn't read very well or anything else. And Mrs. Eunice Park, who is the headmaster Gordon Park's wife, basically saved me and turned me into who I am now at age 72 through an intervention that was very interesting. She came out of the staff room one day as I was wandering by, barely 10 years old and failing at everything, and said, Schaeffer, um, have you applied to be in Marriage of Figaro and the opera? And we were doing a scaled down children's version of the operetta. And I said, well, I can't learn anything. I can't read or whatever. She says, well, perhaps you could learn to sing it if I sang with you. And for the next 2 months, every day for an hour after tea in the afternoon while other boys did prep, she sat at this old tuneless upright piano in the dining hall, smelling of carrots and toad in the hole and all the rest of the British things we ate, plonking away on this tuneless piano, teaching me to sing the part of the Count in Figaro, which I did perform as a child, unable to read well at the time, but able to sing the part because she took the time to save me.
Yeah. Oh,
And
this
her,
is beautiful.
yeah, and her gentleness, and I
Yes.
tear up thinking about it. So when I was 60 years old, I'm 72 now, I flew back to the UK to thank her. And by that time, she was in her late 80s. I literally just walked up to the door and knocked on the door and said, I've come here to thank you.
Wow.
And that I'm a writer and I've had some bestsellers and I owe it all to you, Mrs. Park. I still called her Mrs. Park. And gave her
How
a
did
big
she
hug.
respond? Did she remember that time
Oh,
with the
she
piano?
remembered me vividly.
Yeah. What a
But the funny
beautiful
thing
story.
is, her taking the time with this little boy
Mhm.
changed my life because she did what you're talking about. And so when I was reading your book, I thought, I have encountered many mothers, my own, but other mothers who intervened in my life as a young male and said, there's more out there and you can do this. And my road into that world was through art, hands on, being taught that maybe you can't learn to read yet because you're so far behind, but I will teach you to sing this and we'll do it together.
That's so wonderful. I think
Yeah.
it just that story is so beautiful and it speaks to so much because I think there's so many threads in our culture which are just like with boys, you want to toughen them up and,
Yeah.
they've got to be stronger, they've got to be, and you sort of helping them by being tough with them. And
Yeah.
that's like an old story that's coming from, from ancient whatever. But then you've
Exactly.
also got this new story, which is like boys are toxic. They need to shut up. They need to be quiet. They're so privileged, that more of a sort of post Me Too story coming from the left.
Yeah.
And I think, which is like, we've got to be harsh on boys and mean and, but actually boys, well, every human, but perhaps especially boys, because they don't get so much of that naturally, they respond so well to this like empathetic being seen and heard as a human being and being empathized with. And that's where I want everyone to start. When I was writing and sort of, when people say, well, what are your solutions? It's not like specific things that, here's a script to like read with your son that, this is what you must say to your son in order to get them to be a good man. It's exactly what you're describing. It's just this like very real, very authentic interaction with another human being that you love them, you see them, you care about them, and that you want them to succeed. And for you, that was singing. It could be something different for somebody else, but it's just this very profound emotional experience that you can get from that. Oh, I lost your sound though. Can you hear me?
I
I
hear
can't.
you fine. I muted
Oh,
myself so I could clear my
okay. Now I
throat.
hear you again.
Yeah, but I
Oh, okay.
wanted to just go to another passage in your book, which I just screwed up by muting myself instead. But here you write, I think, about this kind of world we're living in with 4chan and 8chan or whatever it is, and other explicitly violent, misogynistic online forums. This is the where our kids are going to live, where our boys live. Theirs is a worldview born of grievance and self-victimization that positions men as the real victims in society and feminism as the enemy. Its chief target for hate is generally women. There is a notorious overlap between misogyny, white supremacy, homophobia, and anti-Semitism in online spaces. And of course, when I was growing up, it was kind of different. You were supposed to be tough and so forth on the sports field. But when I think of, my growing up as a young man in the 50s and the 1960s, um, it was a different environment. We were not being fed this steady diet on our phones of the kind of heroics of the Andrew Tates of the world, where it's all about collecting hand-hammered Ferrari bodies and women and whatever else they do and kickboxing. It was in some ways the world was more brutal because there was more actual overt racism, segregation in the US and so forth. But the expectation of men was that, while the woman will take care of the kids, gentleness wasn't frowned upon. It wasn't all kickboxing and cage fighting all the way down. Whereas now it's sort of tipped more, I think, into a violent misogyny that I
Yes.
didn't experience as a young man. The men I knew, the older men I knew, were not pushing me in that direction.
Yeah, I think it's a really complicated time because it speaks to this conflict between left and right that I see coming up in modern times. So I think back, in the 50s and 60s, the model of masculinity was like a family man, a provider, a protector, and that model is gone. The economics of it have changed. Women are working, men, don't need to be a traditional breadwinner in that sense. And so power structures have changed. And I think now, men are sort of being fed this model, which is just, as you say, or as I write, about this kind of hand-to-hand combat and cage fighting and all the rest of it, which is kind of making up for this void. But like, I think what men are responding to, or boys are responding to, is this sense of like, the way we're being raised doesn't feel good. I don't feel seen and heard. I don't
Yeah,
feel like I belong. Everybody's angry at me.
yeah,
Everyone's telling me to. So we've got this bunch of people telling me to man up and suppress my emotions from that sort of right-wing tough guy, old
yeah,
school masculinity. And we're getting all these voices from the left saying, time to shut up. You're terrible. You're toxic. Don't speak. It's everybody else's turn. Your problems don't matter. Stop centering yourself. So I think they feel terrible. They feel this resentment. Someone like Andrew Tate comes along and says, okay, well, I can give you the answer. You're supposed to be this masculine ideal and I'm going to help you get there. And so
yeah,
they glom onto it because they're not getting a positive alternative elsewhere. And they've been fed, I think by the time somebody like Andrew Tate comes along, they're primed to receive this message.
yeah.
Ever since the earliest days, they're getting these like superhero stories. And like, it sounds innocuous and it kind of is, but in another way, it's like, this is your model of masculinity. You're
Yeah.
this like hyper muscled, you save the world, you save the day. You don't get this kind of idea of yourself in this like relational system. And you see that like the Andrew Tates of this world, he like preys on all these tropes of boyhood.
Yeah.
He's like always uses superhero analogies the whole time. He's like, I'm Batman, I have a bat cave,
Yeah.
I'm strong, I'm tough, and he talks like a little boy. He
Well, as
uses,
does Donald Trump,
as does Donald Trump. Absolutely. It's just this
including
like,
action hero posters that I thought were actually a joke someone had put up to defame him,
yeah.
ripping his thing up, and he's got the Superman thing, and it doesn't bear thinking about, but there you are.
Yeah, no, but you're right. It's Donald Trump is exactly like that. They're stuck in this kind of slightly toddlerhood model of what it means to be a man, is this cartoon. And they've been told right from birth that they are supposed to be that. They feel
Yeah.
all this shame that they can never achieve that. And that's other research that I look into in the book, which is just like it's not masculinity itself that's the problem. It's this shame of never meeting that standard for masculinity because nobody can meet it. It's completely impossible. This is what I talk about, impossible masculinity. This superhero myth, nobody can be that because no human can achieve that. And where the sort of violence and the misogyny and all the rest of it lives is in that shame of not feeling masculine enough.
Yeah, one thing you get into, and this is a good segue into that, as you say that boys are working within two conflicting systems, one that demands they be sensitive, cautious, and emotionally nuanced, while the other encourages them to be domineering, emotionally stunted, and borderline aggressive. And then I'm quoting you here, and the consequence of failure can be severe in both systems. And this opens the door to another part of your discussion, which you do very well in terms of sexuality and boys and what they expect. Okay, here's a quote. Stray too far in one direction and you are a pussy. Stray too far in the other and you might be canceled. As 20-year-old Zach put it, because you interview people, it feels like we are set up to fail. And then you go into, this boy who you interview, and I've got the quote here, but I'll just recap it, who said to you, can I kiss you? He's heard that consent is a thing, doesn't know how to do it. How do you do consent? She's consented to be kissed. Now does she consent to this next thing? And then you follow some cases which are kind of heartbreaking and scary. Thinking as a grandfather of, Jack, my 14-year-old, or my son John, who went into the Marine Corps and fought in Afghanistan, and then we went to the University of Chicago, came back and married. Now he has these 3 kids across the street that I'm taking care of. But when I look at the passage to manhood, and I realize that in your book, you're talking about people who are sometimes falsely accused of being sexually predators or rape or whatever it be on campus, with very few layers of checks and balances in the investigation and so forth. And you're a feminist at the same time. So let's turn the page here and get into all that. Get into how, people being told they need consent. But then what about just youthful passion? How does that play with this? What are young men supposed to do? Who's telling them how to do this? So it's not just the brutalization of the Andrew Tates. It's that they're entering a world in which males are not given the benefit of the doubt. And they're scary figures, One other thing, parenthetically, and then you get into the sort of desexualization, what you would call the kind of final sigh of the sexual revolution, which ends with people not even dating or having sex at all. The kind of things
like avoiding sex altogether. I mean, that is a very real thing.
It's so complicated, let's not even do that.
Yeah, right. So this whole section of the book was by far the most challenging to get right, I think. And I don't, I hope that when I say get right, there's no right, but I
think you got it right.
Oh, well, thank you. I really appreciate that because it's very hard to navigate. Because I want to say, first off, of course, as a feminist, it's so important to tackle violence against women, to tackle sexual assault. These things are terrible problems, and men were allowed to get away with them for so long. And then when Me Too came about, we saw this explosion where we, and as women and girls, it felt very exhilarating in that moment to be able to call out all this systemic male bad behavior. And that is very, very real. But I think in the years since, something quite complicated has happened. And what started out as a very good impulse, which is let's listen to women, let's believe women, women have been ignored. And it used to be the case that a woman would go and report a sexual assault and everyone would be like, well, suck it up, don't worry about it, or you're lying.
Sure. Or what were you wearing at the party?
What were you wearing? All this terrible stuff. And that still happens. It's not that that doesn't happen anymore. So that is real. That is very real. And I don't want to deny that. But I think this is not a zero-sum thing. Because that is real, it does not mean that it's not also real that we've kind of this culture of accusing boys and men has run away with itself. And I think that things which we would never really have seen as assault in previous generations have now taken on the mantle of assault. And I think we are, as I said before, we don't teach boys these complex relational skills of how to read body language, how to sort of know what another person's thinking, how to navigate those kinds of sexual situations. And absolutely, they are still expected. They are still held to this standard of masculinity. And there is so much research that shows that girls still expect boys to make the first move, be dominant, engage in quite a lot of, quite violent sexual practices as well,
Yeah.
consensually. But like, things like the rise in like choking, or, there are all kinds of sex researchers doing this work that girls expect that of boys. They want them to behave that way. It's not, not all girls, not everything, but there are, it's boys are under these like incredibly contradictory pressures. But then they go too far or they misjudge it, and then, the
All hell
consequences,
breaks loose.
all hell breaks
Or
loose.
what you did on Friday was okay with one person, and then by Sunday you run into
Right.
somebody else, and now you're a rapist.
Now you're a rapist. And also, what you did on Friday with one person wasn't just okay, it was expected. And if you don't do that, then you're a pussy, or like,
Well,
you're
not only that, you've been watching this on your phone on YouPorn,
right, exactly. And that's
and
how you're
basically like
told.
that, and nobody got arrested for that.
Right. And nobody got arrested for that. And, not just, the culture expects it of you. You've been told that you're supposed to be action hero, combat, you've had all these messages, about how masculine you're supposed to be, how you're supposed
Yeah.
to be, dominant. And then also at the same time, you just overstep by a smidge. And some of the stories, the cancellation stories, I went into this being very skeptical. You hear the words cancel culture and you think it's like, oh God, here we go. This sort of right wing coded,
Yeah.
idea that, but some of these stories were just absolutely devastating. And
Yeah.
very, very minor things. The boy who put his arm around the girl in the cafeteria, or the boy who made a comment, or, a sexual encounter that was kind of icky, but it was like complicated and murky. It was not, in
Yeah.
any sense what you would think of as a like forcible rape or a coercion. It was just, and then I think we have to find a way that we can talk about these things with nuance, with empathy. And we're seeing these things, rather than this kind of carceral shaming, sexual shamings of boys, this sort of
Well,
lock
and
them
you
up and
talk
throw
about
away
in
the
your
key.
book how the sexual shaming at the high school level, and all of
Yeah.
a sudden some boy's name is put out there with his picture,
Yeah.
who's accused of either rape or something else that may or may not have happened. And now
Yeah.
he's being bullied and avoided, but that kind of bullying's okay because it's a guy.
Right. Yeah. And
And
I think
he's a
there's this really complicated thing going on where we're like, yes, it's true that male violence against women is a terrible problem. Absolutely. Yes, it's true that there has been this horrible history of sexual violence. Yes, it's true that men often coerce women into sex. These things are all true. But, you know, it's just this guerrilla justice that is happening online. You post someone's picture and there's no nuance in it. The guy
no.
who, who is like, put his arm around the girl in the cafeteria, or the girl who went on the boy who went on a bad date with a girl and the sex ended up in a complicated situation, is in exactly the same category as the serial rapist or Harvey Weinstein.
Yeah, all of a sudden.
And it's, nobody's adjudicating it. It's online and they put a thing over a 14-year-old boy's face saying rapist. This will have consequences for this boy forever.
Yeah, it's a direct
There's no
mirror
due
image
process.
of the young woman who finds that AI has been used to turn her into a porn star, and nobody
Absolutely.
knows the difference between this and reality, and there's no way for her
Right.
to get that back. And meanwhile, Google just made another $100 million in the last 10 seconds with all the algorithms leading people to whatever they want to click on. I mean, there's no
Absolutely.
justice here.
There's no justice. And I think, university administrations have been incentivized to believe women, which is something that I support in the sense of like, take women's experiences seriously, listen to
Yeah.
women, but this like unquestioning, someone makes an accusation and therefore that is at face value and everything, is really damaging. There
Just
needs to
hold
be
your
due
book up
process.
again. I want to reintroduce you because,
Okay.
as I explained at the beginning to anybody who's tuning in, as it were, I read mine on Kindle. There's Boy Mom. That's the cover. By the way, we're going to make this part of our book club. I'm just scrolling down here to see what Ernie put in. When is this book club? November. We're making yours the November offering for It Has to Be Read,
Oh,
which
I
is
love that.
a
Thank
sort
you.
of a pun on my commentary online called It Has to Be Said.
I love that.
But anyway, in conversation with Frank Schaeffer, my guest today is journalist, cultural critic, and author Ruth Whippman, former BBC documentary film director, and many other exciting things. That's not how it's written, but I'm cutting to the chase here. And Ruth is the author of Boy Mom, which we're talking about. Hold it up.
Thank you so
Reimagining boyhood in the age of impossible masculinity. I love that.
I also, could I just add something to our point about
Please.
talking about the sort of sexual assault thing? I really would like it if people would actually read the chapters there rather than, before like having an opinion about it. I really urge people to read it because it's very complex and it's very nuanced and it's very easy to sort of misrepresent it when you're talking in an interview.
Yeah, and it sounds like, and people make connections. They say, oh, well, that sounds like something else, or didn't Elon
Right.
Musk say something like that? And it's so awful because it means we can't have any real discussions.
We can't have a discussion, and it's so nuanced and the stakes are so high for everybody that I just sort of want people to read it before they.
I want to read something that draws on what you're saying that I'm sort of working on, and I'll try to say when I'm quoting you and when it's me. But anyway, you can come back to the point. So my thing here is I say, well, where to start, and how about here? Women have not been believed, valued, or treated as equals in any capacity, and boys are not being treated well either. For instance, Whippman says in Boy Mom, cancel culture in high school is a system of retribution and, quote, justice that teenagers mete out to each other. This bodes ill. And for the most part, this is a punishment targeted at boys. The boy's picture shows up on social media, often with a caption calling him a rapist or an abuser. No one talks to him in the hallways or invites him to hang out or sits with him in a class at lunch. His friends stop talking to him, and any who do risk being canceled themselves. Whippman writes, quote, I am surprised at how many boys I speak to either have been canceled themselves or have witnessed a friend or classmate going through it. Seemingly, it's a cultural accountability measure taken to extremes. And then you quote somebody, my greatest fear is getting canceled. 20-year-old Henry, a college sophomore in Chicago, tells me, I've only hooked up with one girl since being at college, and I just kept being like, is this okay? Is that okay? Is this okay? Like anytime we would do anything, I'd be like, is this okay? And then I'm going to add something here that is not in your book, and I want you to react to it. And so everybody, again, this is me. This is not Ruth. So don't blame her for what I'm about to read here. I comment, these young, quote, consenting adults are paying for our recent stupidity. It seems to me that when it comes to relationships, sex, love, tenderness, my generation, the boomers, that's us, handed subsequent generations a steaming pile of shit. One aspect of that shit pile is that no one taught today's youths or their most recent cultural forefathers, which is drawing on you, about consent or fertility reality, or help them define success as finding joy in others rather than in money and career. So that's me sort of drawing deeply on your work, quoting you, and then adding my 2 cents worth.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think the boomers gave us many wonderful things, and
The Beatles.
the Beatles, thank you. Yes, Beatles were wonderful, and sexual liberation, and the first moves towards gender equality. My mom was a feminist in the, and I feel like that generation did wonderful work for us in so many ways. But I think, yeah, there was this culture where sexual violence was normalized, and and sexism was normalized, and so I think that we've inherited, today, or not my generation, but the generation of young boys now and young girls are sort of tackling that. They're reinventing it. They're working with it. But it's like we're still at this very sort of complicated stage where we're navigating this stuff. We're trying to throw out one culture. We've got, but much of it still exists. We're in a very, very complicated moment. And I think, you hand this over to a bunch of teenagers, they don't have the best judgment. We know this about teenagers. You can't let teenagers be the justice system for something as important as sexual assault. That they don't have enough life experience, they don't have enough nuance, they don't have enough judgment, they have their own agendas. We know this about adolescence. And I think when you hand this over to kids on social media, the outcomes are not going to be fair or just. But then at the
Yeah,
same time, I feel
yeah,
like the adults are failing them as well. You know, I think college bureaucracies, we haven't got this right.
yeah. You say in your book, I just did that one. We talk. I can never pronounce this woman's name properly, and we're going to try to interview her. So please help me. You know, Twangy or Twain?
Oh yeah, I think it's twingy, but I don't want
Okay.
to.
I keep asking my producer, and Ernie Gregg is good at all this, but I don't know even Ernie knows how to say Twangy right.
I think it's Jean Twingy, but I
You know, I
don't
know
want to
it's
say
Gene
that.
something. I get the
Yeah,
Gene part,
yeah.
but she goes a step further and she talks about insecurities and loss of purpose specifically,
Mhm.
and you do as well. And then you kind of both make the same point. And so I want to ask you a couple things. Do you think that, and I'm going to do a few little bullet points here. I think people moving away from family in America all the time, there's no intergenerational support system to counterbalance what you're getting on your phone. The older segregated from you. When I look at the impact I'm having on my grandchildren's lives by cooking for them, picking them up at school, talking to them, working with them in my garden, I'm providing an entire alternative universe to the online universe. And I'm not doing it on purpose. That's
Yeah.
just what I want to do for them. But as I look around at the school, I'm in the schoolyard picking them up. Most of the time, I'm the only guy there.
Yes.
Everybody else has moved somewhere else. They're down in Florida getting STDs or something, and I'm still here with my grandchildren. And then I say, and with that loss of connection goes the collective memory of generations of parents and grandparents. So I think it is my idea here that besides just how we're treating boys, the village, as it were, has so eroded in terms of just stay in one place, know your neighbors, work in your garden, be there when your kids come home. And I'm not talking about moms without careers. I'm talking about grandparents now at my stage of life. Be around, stay
Yes.
involved with people, become their best friends. You know, that the kind of, I don't know how to put this, but the sort of dissolution of the village and
Yes.
the segregation of the elderly and the segregation of the young and the fact that there's young people's activities and then young adult we're not, and then kids go to college and they break up their relationships and they sort of think these new friendships will sustain them, but then they all go to other places because of their jobs. We have designed a culture that basically cuts out all the kind of modifying experiences of life, and we're left with these sort of glaring loud exclamation points. Porn online, that's where you
Yes.
get your sex education. Sort of a radical feminism that tells you it's all about women, and then on the other hand, Andrew Tate telling you basically rape is
Mhm.
okay, and as soon as you get a Bugatti you're made.
Right. No,
And
it's
then
so true.
yeah, so what the fuck.
Yeah, no, I feel when you were talking, I feel this so keenly, and it's interesting to hear it from your perspective because I guess I sit from the other side of it as well, which is like the perspective of parents raising young children, and this like we have very little support. We don't have the support of grandparents. I mean, I know some people who have the support of their parents when they're raising their own children, but a lot of people, as you say, they're living in a different city or a different
Yeah,
country in our case. And it's absolutely so there's this huge burden on parents. And at the same time, there's this idea that parenting is this project, that there's all this like parenting advice and guilt, and it's all on you, and you've got to turn out the perfect child, and they've got to get into this elite college, and you've got to that you have this
yeah.
a lot this like idea in the culture that you have this huge amount of control over the outcome if you
Well, and
do all
it's
the right things.
parenting defined by our idea of success. You get into the
Yes,
elite college, you earn six figures, you move ahead. And then
absolutely.
if you do fall in love in high school or college, woe betide you, because
Yes.
you're going to be told, no, 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 no. It's all about career or education or go get that master's
Yeah.
degree now. And so by the time you finally get to the sort of slow love phase, which is this phrase that's come in some other people's books that I've been talking to them about online recently, where you can barely date and then you find somebody and you live with them for 5 years and then you decide they're not the right person. Now you're into your 30s, someone's freezing their eggs, on it goes. You get to the next stage, and this inability to form what would have once been regarded as normal relationships that
Yes.
provide a context for everybody's childhood is
Yes,
just going out the
absolutely.
window.
No, absolutely. And there's this idea that we're all kind of slightly, as parents, in competition with other parents raising other children, and our children have to beat their children at, and this is this idea in the culture that we're all kind of trying for this, as you say, this end goal based on these values that, and this is when I say all parents, I'm talking about a sort of certain section of privileged parenting communities, but across the board, as you say, communities are breaking down. We're all doing this in isolation. People, we don't have the village to support us. And I think it's a terrible environment to parent in. Kids lose out from these multi-generational, rich, complex experiences of
Yeah.
learning from previous generations, learning from grandparents, learning from extended family, and just seeing themselves as part of this relational system. And I think the impacts in some ways are bigger on boys than they are on girls because of the other problems with, our failure to teach boys these relational skills. They're going in at a disadvantage. And then when they don't have their grandpa or their extended family or their auntie or their whatever, looking out for them in that way, the impact is even greater.
Yeah, and they don't see the example of older generations who, and I'm working on a project now, which I mentioned to you, but the gist of it is how I went from being a sort of, evangelical white misogynist who expected my wife to obey me because that's how I saw my mother relate to my father, to a long journey. Jeannie and I have been together 54 years now. So and we're grandparents, and I performed the wedding of one of my grandsons in France last summer, and so forth and so on. So we're in that stage of life and basically have seen what worked or didn't work. And one reason I love your book, if I can put it this way, and this sounds incredibly presumptuous, but at 72, having raised these kids and being a grandparent, a young parent, and all those things I'm talking about, I actually know some shit now. And I can say, I know you are right.
Thank you. Well,
And
that's
my
really,
life experience says Boy Mom is a book everybody should read. I know Ruth Whippman is correct. I've lived it, I've seen it, I know it, I'm doing it. And you've written the book on the subject. So I know that's sort of weird to say that way, but I really
hold it
mean
up
it.
again. I really appreciate that. Thank you. That's really lovely to hear. And I just admire your wisdom on all of these
Yeah,
topics and
but
the way.
anyway, what I want to get to, besides complimenting you and saying this will be in our November book club and urging people to get it. And if you have a son or a grandson, or people trying to raise boys or help boys, or you're a teacher or an educator, or anybody even vaguely interested in the future of our culture, you better damn well read Ruth's book because it's really important. And it's not just another book out there. And it's a one of a kind, by the way, because there's lots of books on the journeys women taking and so forth. And it's such a good answer to these horrible people on the right who use some of these issues in a manipulative way to advance their thing. You actually care about boys. I just have to say that. It's written from the place of love of a mother for her sons. It's not written from wagging your finger in people's faces. So I think anybody but the hardest idiot would understand, just as you were saying on the sexuality chapters. Don't draw any conclusions from what you've heard it. Read the damn book because it's very nuanced and it's really good. Okay. So I have a question for you in terms of the future. Do you think that some of these things can be repaired? Let me get into the section of your book where you talk about solutions of how to do this. You're actively now participating with kids at a very formative age. Your kids are that actual age now that people worry about. How's it working out? What do you do that you talk about in your book? But forget the book, just you personally. How's this balancing out in your own life with this keen awareness and the study you've done on boys, and now you're still being a boy mom? How's it working for you, Ruth?
Oh, that's such a great question. Well, I think there's sort of two questions bound up in there. One of them is like, do I feel hopeful on a social, cultural level that we can change this? And the answer is yes, absolutely. I really am. I think we've made huge strides culturally in the way that we talk about women, about women's opportunities.
Yeah.
The culture has meaningfully changed. When I look back to my childhood, my mom's childhood, my grandmother's childhood, the culture is very, very different when it comes to women's opportunities, women's roles, etc., etc.
Yeah.
Cultural change has happened, cultural change is possible. And that comes from many, many people doing great work, many different conversations, lots of fighting, lots of, just little things happening all the
Sure.
time at an incremental level. Yes, we can do that with boys. Absolutely. We just need to start. We need to have those conversations. We need
Yeah.
to make it real. And in my own life, yeah, do you know, it's been such a wonderful journey. I think, as if you read the book, you'll see that we went through a very challenging time in our parenting journey. We had three very wild, very rambunctious, quite challenging boys. This is not a story of me doing everything perfectly and getting the perfect outcome. I wrestle with it in the book, and I wrestle with it in my own life, and it was really hard. And a lot of the time, I was doing all this work. I was trying to get them interested in stories about relationships. I was trying to talk to them about feelings. I was doing all this, and they were like, I don't care. This is dumb. I don't want anything to do with it. It was not this easy thing that they're like, thank you, mother, for enlightening me to this. It was not like that at all. But what I realized is that this is not a like one for one thing. It's not like you have this conversation and then they're like, yes, thank you. And they go and change. It's little bits of things all along. And now my kids, so my oldest is going to turn 14 next month. Then my middle is going to be 11 next month. And then I have a 6-year-old as well. And I can see now the things that we were trying like a year or 2 years or 5 years ago are starting to come to fruition now, And I mean, my eldest two especially, they're so thoughtful and so sensitive and so just delightful and fun. They're a work in progress. They make mistakes, they screw up. I don't want to hold them to some standard. I don't. One of the problems with writing this book is I don't want to put them in some terrible position where they're like, we are the ones whose mom wrote this book. And
hey, what happened to A. Milne's boy?
Oh God, yes, I can imagine.
You're going to get the next Winnie the Pooh.
Robin.
Yeah, Christopher Robin, it destroyed him.
Oh God, I read about that.
His life was completely fucked forever because of the book. But of course, he was you're not turning your kids into Christopher Robin. I mean, it's fine.
They're not. And so I don't want them to be held to some ridiculous standard where they can never mess up because, but I see that they're so thoughtful, they're so sensitive, they're so engaged, they're so lovely. And, things that I thought they were just completely ignoring, I'll see.
They heard.
They heard, yeah.
Well, and they were watching you too. And I don't want to dig into things that aren't specifically in your book, but I think part of that is just what they see in terms of the male-female relationship with husbands, wives, and lovers, and so forth. I mean, obviously, it's not just you talking to them. It's how you live.
Right. And also, I want to give a huge shout out to their dad, my husband now, who is an amazing father. And he's been so engaged in this work. And I think it was really meaningful for him as well, because he, I think once I was researching this and pointing this stuff out, he was like, oh, yes, I can see how these things that happen in my childhood are leading to loneliness and isolation in my adult life, or like my male friendships. And he was like, yeah, I want different for my kids. So he was very much engaged in it. He's a wonderful parent, much more natural at parenting than I am,
Well, they're lucky to have you too. And is he from the UK as well?
Yes, he is. Yeah.
And did you both move over here and become sort of Americans, or are you going to go back sometime, or what's the deal?
So I was already an American citizen. My mom is actually from America, but I was born in the UK. She moved over 50 something years ago. So I was born there. And but I got citizenship through her, which was how we managed to move to the States. So we've been raising our kids here, since my oldest was a year old. So, we're very rooted in this community.
Yeah, that's great. So you're sticking around. And Jeannie and I, like I say, we've been together 54 years, and we've been in the same house for 44 years. So in this little neighborhood in New England where I live, so we know our neighbors and everybody knows where they're from. And my grandchildren and my children have grown up in one place. Unlike me, my parents were expatriate Americans called by God to go to Switzerland and evangelize not just the Swiss, but it was an English-speaking ministry. And then my father became a religious right leader. Oh, wow. And if you look at history books, it's, quote, credited with the beginning of the religious right in this country in the 70s and 80s. So we knew Ronald Reagan and the Bush presidents and all these people. My mother would stay in the White House every time she went to Washington with Betty Ford. And I had Mike Ford living in my house for a year in Switzerland before we lived, his President Ford's son. So that's my background. Wow. And then I left all of it and became something completely different. And I've written novels and books about that. But, since my grandchildren have started to be born, I made a real decision, which was, I fucked up a lot of things in my life. I'm not fucking this one up. I am going to be a hands-on caregiving grandfather. And that's what I've been doing solidly now with these youngest three for 15 years. And I have to just tell you, as a male, that this is the single most satisfying, deeply rewarding part of my life.
That's
And one of the things that's been rewarding is stepping back and allowing my wife to do many, many things during her life by sharing that work with her, with my kids, and then with my grandchildren, and having a relationship with them, which is the best part of my life. So when a man does do that, all I can say is if you read Ruth's book and you're a male and you want to be that person, I can tell you, she's got 14-year-olds she's telling this to, but I can tell you from the perspective of a 72-year-old man who does childcare, cooks for his kids, teaches them gardening and carpentry and all the rest of it, that what I've seen in their lives and the richness that has brought them is the single best thing that I've ever done, period. Nothing else matters in comparison.
that's
And
wonderful.
so I really love your book because it's a roadmap from where I was once to another place in terms of just how you define success.
That's really so wonderful to hear. And I'm sure they benefit so much from having you
Yeah.
in their life and, giving this different perspective and all this wisdom and experience and showing them a different way.
Well, the thing is, and I know I'm not being clever here, but just like you said, you weren't the perfect mom and everything. I started out as such an asshole. I mean, I was on that, not quite Andrew Tate like, but really in a jerky mode and a real, pig at certain points. And then really came to believe what you're writing, if in a sort of a different context, and changed, not overnight, but with a great deal of struggle. Unfortunately, married to a woman who knew I was trying and helped. But when I got through the tunnel and came out where the natural thing for me is to care and to love and to connect and to say I love you and hug these grandchildren and watch my grandsons hug me back and tell me they love me. When you get there, and
Incredibly
that's your version of
meaningful.
being a
Yeah.
man, when you've gone from being a real asshole
Yeah.
to that, and you've done it in one lifetime, looking back at 74, this trip is worth the journey. It's worth the price of admission. So I haven't read a book that has spoken to me more profoundly because it's like, yeah, she's right. This is what works. Everybody must read this. I mean, if someone asked me, I've got a son, or what does it mean to be a man? I would just say, well, let's just start with Ruth's book, and then we'll talk.
This is so incredibly lovely to hear. One of the things that's really surprised me actually since this book came out was that how it's resonated with men. When we were discussing like what title to give it, and we chose to call it Boy Mom because, it was in the air and it spoke to the mother-son
Yeah,
relationship. But, I thought that would probably exclude male readers. But what I've been really surprised is lots of men have been contacting me and saying, it's really spoken to them
yeah.
and resonated, and they see themselves and their childhoods and their journeys in it. And that's been a really special and lovely surprise,
Well,
that I
I'm
wasn't.
hoping they see their sons and grandsons and say, okay, we
Yes,
can do better here.
we can change it. Yeah, right. And and I thought I would get all this pushback from men being like, no, we want to be a real man and real men are tough. And
Yeah.
actually that's not what I'm hearing at all. They're saying actually that was harmful for us and we want to do better.
Yeah, one book that I refer to a lot, and we'll wrap it up in a minute because we're going a bit long here, but I don't care, is a book by Elizabeth Marshall Thomas called The Old Way. In the 1950s, her dad founded Raytheon, and and got this crazy idea. She's a wonderful writer, by the way, and happens to have the same agent as I do. So I was introduced to her years ago by my agent, but I don't mean personally, but her work. But The Old Way is an incredible book, and you would enjoy it.
I'll look forward to
It's
that.
not new, but she lived in the Kalahari Desert with the Bushmen in the Kalahari, the Kung. And her father took her over there for 2 years, and her mother was an anthropologist. And then she was only 19, but they all kept notes. And there's a point to this, what I'm telling you. What's amazing to me is that they were the first people from outside the Kalahari to ever visit this group. And to the best of the knowledge of experts, this group had been in that area unbroken with no outside influence at all for, and you'll think I'm making this up, 80, that's 80,000 years, not 80,000 years. There's
Oh,
evidence
wow.
that they had been subsisting hunter-gathering for 80,000 years,
Amazing.
and they survived, and males and females were equal, and
Yeah.
men did childcare. And remember, she was making these notes in the 1950s,
Yeah.
long before feminism in the modern iteration was a
Yeah.
thing. She had nothing to prove. She was just observing them. And her mother was
Amazing.
observing them. Did the women have orgasms? Did the men do childcare? Just sort of sociological, anthropological, scientific questions. And all I want to tell you is that if you read The Old Way, this Be a Man, these are hunter-gatherers. They're killing meat. And
Yeah.
okay, but the women know where all the food is. And the women distribute the poison arrows for the men to use. And the women distribute the meat. And they have an equal say with the males. And the
Yeah.
boys, the teenage boys, help raise kids. They are child minders. Boys are child minders. And she has no agenda in this book. And so I just want to tell you, it gave me a lot of hope, because all this male macho bullshit, would assume that somehow, well, back in the day, it's always looking backward to a time when men were real men. Well, I'm
Right.
sorry. They did this for 80,000 years.
It's, yeah.
These are hunter-gatherers who could
Yeah.
kick your ass. They would poison Andrew Tate with an arrow 10 minutes after he walked into their center for his rudeness. He'd be gone, because they didn't do that.
So true.
It
And
was
I
all
think,
respect and care and
yeah.
community. This was the village before it got fucked up. So
Yeah.
I reference her book so much in my own work and in my own head. Was there ever a there before it got all fucked up with agrarian culture and land ownership and industry and men and going to work and women being home? No, there really was a time in basic human evolutionary history when what you espouse in your book actually happened.
It's really
And
wonderful. I know it
yeah,
is, I think this idea of masculinity is a modern construct, as you say, and yes, there is a better way, and I will read that book. That sounds wonderful.
yeah, The Old Way by Elizabeth Marshall Thomas, and she's a wonderful writer, by the way. But what strikes me is that what I'm trying to say is this juxtaposition of, are we going to do what Ruth says, or are we going to do what Elon Musk and Donald Trump want? And somehow they're going, there's an old-fashioned way to be a man, and we've lost that. Yeah, we lost it, but exactly the way you say, not what they're saying,
Yeah,
because the caregiving model was the village, and the
it's
men
real.
didn't just go out and hunt; they helped with the kids.
Yeah. No,
And
it's
they were
it's
gentle, and they were not coercive.
yeah. I know, and they were probably so much healthier and happier as a result.
Yeah, it's a really interesting book, by the way. It's a terrific read.
Oh, I will get that one. Thank you.
Well, hold your book up one more time, please. I'm
Go
sorry, I
ahead.
should have
Boy,
gotten a copy.
mom.
Boy, Mom, and Ruth's the author, and Reimagining Boyhood in the Age of Impossible Masculinity. Please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcast.com, and to my Substack, it has to be said at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And we've just been live on YouTube, and this will stay there, but it'll go other places, and then it becomes a podcast. And one last request I have for you: when I ring off here, as it were, get off the air, if that's what we're on, please stick around, because I have a question for you that I want you to talk to my producer, Ernie, about. I'd like to ask you if you recommend that we interview anybody else that's doing something useful apropos of what you think should be done. It doesn't have to be about the same thing, but please tell us an author, a friend, a writer,
Yeah, I've got
person
a
who's
few
had certain
suggestions.
experiences,
Yeah,
anybody you think we should be talking to on this podcast. Please stick around for a second and give Ernie their name and or names, and help us out, because we're always looking for the next person to talk to.
I will do for sure. Thank you.
Anything you want to add?
No, just that if you're interested in my work, you can find me at my Substack, which is called I Blame Society. It's Ruth Whippman, or my website, ruthwhitman.com. And yep, here's the book again.
And we're going to link to your book. We're going to link to those sites. We're going to push everybody in the world in your direction. And if I have a couple $1 billion around, I will not build a rocket. I'll just simply place your book in everyone's hands.
That's wonderful. It's been such a joy talking with you. Thank you so much.
This has been great. I just can't tell you what your book meant to me. It was like, yes, someone showed up and said it.
Thank you so much. I love that.
Yeah, so pleased to meet you. And this is just great. And stick around a minute and talk to Ernie for
I
a
will.
second.
I will.